afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's event, organized by Hong Kong U's newly established Center on Contemporary China and the World, known as the CCCW, 3 C's and 1 W. I'm Li Cheng, professor in the Department of Politics and Public Administration and the director of CCCW. Today, CCCW is truly honored to feature Professor Yan Xuetong, an internationally renowned scholar, a most captivating speaker among the Tsinghua faculty, and the visionary bridge builder for world peace. I know many of you in the audience here are fans of Professor Yan, also a lot of journalists from BBC, Tsinghua, New York Times, Washington Post, and NBC, CBS, and the South China Morning Post. Welcome. And therefore, instead of making a more conventional introduction to mention his long list of official titles and academic achievements, I would like to use these 3 characterizations to present him to you. First, an internationally renowned scholar. My first meeting with Xuetong, and actually he might have forgotten, but I remember vividly. I went way back, all the way to the later 1980s, when we were both studying at UC Berkeley. And more accurately, I began my master's degree program in Asian studies while he was completing his PhD, a doctoral degree in political science. He studied under some of the America's most influential political scientists. And 2 decades later, Dr. Yan himself emerged as a leading scholar in the international politics in the world. And author of the more than 20 books. He just gave me the latest book. And I think probably it's already 30s. And because look at the previous bios about the more than 20 books. And he was recognized as one of the world's top 100 public intellectuals by Foreign Policy magazine in 2008. He has received many prestigious public awards and titles, including a foreign academician, Yan Si, of the Russian Academy of Sciences in 2019. Second, a most captivating speaker among the Tsinghua faculty. Professor Yan is a teacher highly respected and adored by the young generation. His students proudly call themselves from the Yan sector or Yanmen. This is widely circulated at Tsinghua. Listening to his lectures is considered as one of the top 10 most do's at the Tsinghua University. His classes are always packed, overflowing, even though they are already held in a lecture hall that seats 600 people. Professor Yan, you should share your secret how to make attending CCCW events as a must-do event for Hong Kong U students. So we'll discuss about that after your talk. Third and finally, a visionary bridge builder for world peace. Professor Yan took the initiative in 2012, 12 years ago, established the World Peace Forum at the Tsinghua University, actually in Beijing, from scratch, really. To date, this forum has held 11 editions. I think I was so honored to attend maybe 2 of them. It's a really wonderful international conference in Beijing, one of the signature events in Beijing. Our world is now facing increasingly serious deficits in peace, security, and governance. And one of the remarkable things about this forum, right from its inception, it has displayed foresight by emphasizing the voices from now what we call Global South. At that time, probably the term did not exist, only in the academia. As the Global South has gained in importance on the world stage, regional studies are increasingly influencing China's international engagement. Professor Yan, you are a truly visionary thinker and a doer. Today's moderator is Professor Daniel Bill, the chair of political theory at the Faculty of Law, Hong Kong U, and also our CCCW Distinguished Fellow. He previously served as the Dean of the School of Political Science and Public Administration at the Shandong University, probably only foreigner served as the Dean in social science college. He is also, he also taught at the Tsinghua University, a colleague of Professor Yan Xuetong. Daniel Bill is also the editor of a series published by Princeton University about the Chinese thinkers, and including Professor Yan's Ancient Chinese Thought, Modern Chinese Power. Professor Yan will speak first for about 30 minutes or so, and on a very timely and important topic, counter-globalization and the competition of great powers. His talk will be followed by an exchange, like fireside chat style discussion between Professor Yan and Professor Bill. They will leave enough time, maybe 40 minutes or so, for audience Q&A. We deliberately choose a more intimate lecture venue to facilitate discussion with the audience. A room with the size of 1/5 of Professor Yan's regular 600 people lecture hall at the Tsinghua. Now, this event will, of course, be available virtually in the future, probably in a few days, and will be available by YouTube as well, and reaching thousands of viewers. Colleagues, friends, and students, please welcome our guest of honor today, Professor
Yan. Thank you, Professor Li Cheng, and for this very valuable opportunity and to exchange views with your distinguished guests. And it's not the first time for me to visit Hong Kong, but then it's quite long ago. I made the trip many years ago. So it's I have a lot of new impression about the city. And it's the first time for me to visit the Hong Kong University. And I hope I will have more opportunities to come to this university and exchange views with all of you. Well, today, actually, I just want to discuss about two things. One is the general background for the major powers competition. That means counter-globalization. And then the second is how these major powers to behave themselves under this background. And actually, since we're talking about the counter-globalization, I will just give a very brief description about why I'm considering these things is very important. Because I believe the counter-globalization is the main feature of the current global order. This is it's very, very important, has a global influence on everyone. And actually, when we're talking about the order, we have to make a distinction, the order and the types of order, or order types. And whether there's an order, it depends on the existence or the absence of the order. It depends on the war or peace at the international line. So now we see in Ukraine, no one said there's an order. But then you come to Hong Kong, we say, hey, here's the order, right? Okay, that's very clear. But then many people do not make a distinction between the order and the order types. Today, we have an order. During the Cold War, we also have a kind of order. And after Cold War, we also kind of order. But these three orders are different. They are not the same. So what reference we use to define the character or the types of the global order? That's my personal view. I suppose, and the international norms should be used as the reference to define the types of the order. So for instance, during the Cold War, we have the order And actually what is also is a rivalry between the major powers, but that rivalry is different from today, that during that period, and mainly they're driven. I mean, the competition between them driven by ideological expansion, right? They try to expand their ideology through what? Through the approach of the proxy wars. Today, I doubt anyone would believe China and the US will go to the proxy war for winning the competition. Then later on, I will discuss about it, why and this kind of a strategy and or ideological expansion is no longer useful. And after the Cold War, and we have a new order, and we often use the term labor order to title that period. So that means that during this period, we mainly we understand the major feature of the order of post-Cold War is guided by the norm of the marketization and the democratization, right? Economically and politically, respectively. And so nowadays we find that the labor order is winning, and possibly it's already ended. We're moving into a new type of order. This order, I don't know what it is. Maybe there's no common name for it. But personally, I will use the term counter-globalization as a title for the existing order. Why? Because before the post-Cold War, or before the end of the Cold War, there was no globalization. And the globalization started, and the real globalization is not from the 500 years ago, and that kind of ancient context between the ancient states. For modern globalization started from the end of the Cold War, right? And then now we move in new order, is that because it's after globalization, so we can have a counter-globalization. Before globalization, you have nothing to counter, right? So that is a very different character for the current the order. So now, since we know this counter-globalization and is the main feature of the order, and what it is, what's the content of the counter-globalization? I think we should make a distinction between the three terms: globalization, anti-globalization, deglobalization, and the counter-globalization. And generally speaking, the globalization mainly composed by economic marketization and the political democratization. All of us know that. And in the early period of the 1990s, and it even was known as Americanization in China. Later on, this term disappeared. And after China joined the WTO, we think globalization is a positive thing. We benefit a lot economically from the globalization. So even today, our policy is supporting economic globalization. Now you see why supporting economic globalization, because globalization composed of two parts. Political part is a political democratization. That's not the part supported by the Chinese government. And then actually the anti-globalization is nothing new. It's just the twin of the globalization, started from early 1990s. And that time, you have many people hold demonstration against the WTO, right? And the most famous movement is occupying the Wall Street. So that movement and actually becomes a global movement. Then what? It cannot stop the progress of globalization. Why? Why globalization can overcome anti-globalization and keeping moving forward? The reason is that the actors of anti-globalization has no power. They're ordinary people. They do not hold the national sovereignty. But then from the 2017, and when the UK withdraw from the EU, and then the government, I mean the British government, used the power in their hand to what? To reduce economic interdependence with the other countries, mainly with the European countries. and reduce economic cooperation with the European countries. And certainly it's followed by Trump administration and initiated the trade war against China. So then this deglobalization refers to what? The government policy or government behavior reduce economic cooperation and stop globalization, right? So then because the deglobalization started by the governments with the sovereignty, and then when they mutually learn from each other, the counter-globalization becomes what? Becomes the trend. If only one power to adopt the deglobalization policy, the other countries say no. The other countries continue to advance globalization. The counter-globalization cannot become a trend because of all of the other countries and follow that, and then it becomes a trend. Well, this is in most cases, people talking about this economy. How about the political aspect of the globalization? Actually, the typical case is the war in Gaza. Actually, it started from the war in Ukraine. And the Western countries and those countries advanced, advocated, and the human rights started to abandon the principle of human rights. After the Cold War, and along with the globalization and the human rights norm becomes dominating, overwhelmed sovereignty norms. But how about now? You find that both the sovereignty and the human rights undermined by these powers' behavior, by their policy. So nowadays, I use the term, I think now people are talking about the hypocrisy of these countries' behavior. When on the one hand, they're talking about human rights. On the other hand, they send arms to Netanyahu's government, killing the women and the children. So they think it's a hypocrisy. So I think this is a kind of hypocrisization. And politically, hypocrisization means that violating the norm of both sovereignty and human rights. On the other hand, and then they talking about, but we should establish an order based on rules. So everyone knows that there's a series of differences between China and the US, or even a quarrel about how to define the term order based on rules. China ask a question, hey, what rules? What rules you think we should use for as the base of the order? US never gave you a clear definition, never clarify what the rule is. He said, okay, you know. That means that they just selectively use the rules, and sometimes when they do not no longer respect or violate rules, hey, this is not the rules. We do not mean these rules. We mean that rules. So now that you see, actually, there's no rules governing major powers of behavior. And so actually, so from my understanding, the competition between the major powers, and I don't think we are going to see who is more wiser or who is smarter and whose strategy can make a progress, but actually because the momentum or the momentum of populism, and you find that major powers adopt a lot of self-damaging policy. The policy do not help their country achieve their national interests. Actually, the policy or strategy they adopt undermine their national interests. So in the future, I will see it's not the country who made the right decision to win the competition. It's the country make a less wrong decision and may win the competition, right? So just compete to see whose policy undermined or cause less damage to themselves, right? Like that. And okay, certainly whenever we're talking about the IR today, and people definitely will ask about the two wars, the war in Ukraine and the war in Gaza, the two wars. Actually, that's my view. I think the two wars have a different impact on the global order, not the same. Although these two wars are all carried out under the background of a counter-globalization, but their impacts on the trend are different. First, look at this impact of the war in Gaza. This war actually undermines the territorial sovereignty norm, mainly, right? And so now, actually, this norm is not established after Cold War. It's established after the World War II. After World War II, the whole world and agreed to establish the UN, have a UN charter, and based on the norm, so-called the sovereignty, right? And this sovereignty, how important? Actually, the typical case is that after the World War II, most countries agreed to not use military force to change unreasonable and legitimate border. We all know the border for African countries is not right by the colonials, and the drop on the map is very, very unreasonable. But even that, the members of the African Union agree that even it's not the right border, and we should not change the border with force, because if everyone want to crack the border, it means that the war will be endless, right? So this will have a strong impact on what? On the norm of the sovereignty. And certainly, another thing, people talking very little, this war actually undermined the principle of free trade. After the war occurred, because of the sanction from the US and the European countries on the Russia, and then what? And the European countries talking about the decoupling. I'm sorry, the break of the production chain. And so they said, look at that, the gas, oil, and food, and grain, and the fertilizer can no longer and export and import. And European countries even cannot have enough energy to warm the rooms in the winter of 2020. Then what happened? So they developed a concept. It's called economic security. Any of you, I give you a quiz, you will think about it. Do any of you know the definition of economic security? What it is? Where's the border? Where's the scope? What's the limit of economic security? What it is? I doubt anyone have a clear picture, and let alone the definition. What is economic security? Although no one can give a clear definition about the term, but then this concept already have a strong impact on policymakers. They adopt more and more decoupling, de-risking policies to reduce a regional economic cooperation with other countries. That means reduce economic interdependence, right? And so the supply chains, because the war have a strong impact on the supply chain, and so brings to this result. And the other thing, this war in some way and picks up the rise of populism, and make the liberalism and decline faster. The decline of liberalism is not started from the war. It has already for years, but this war actually picks up and make liberalism and lost their influence. The reason is very simple, because the government no longer to adhere to the principle of free trade. For the so-called economic security, the government initiatively reduced economic cooperation and increased the custom and adopted commercial protectionism. So when the government's behavior, government policies are against the principle of free trade, how can you make the liberalism become strong? It's undermine the influence of liberalism. I do not mean that undermine the liberalism, the influence in developing countries, in the state of the South, a global South. It's undermine its influence in Western countries. And populism is gaining momentum. in the Western democracies. So how about the impact of the war in Gaza? Its impact is different. Now, if you look at that, it's certainly also undermine territorial sovereignty, but that's not the major part of the impact of the war, right? Because the sovereignty norms are undermined by many things, and even the Houthi attacked these the commercial ships, right? And in the Red Sea, well, ships are regarded as owners of national territory, moving territory, but then you cannot protect that. And actually, it's mainly strongly, dramatically undermine the norm of human rights. After the Cold War, and members of the UN agreed human rights should be enjoyed by every country, and the norm of human rights in some cases is regarded overwhelming sovereignty. Why? Because they developed the concept of R2P. R2P refers to the responsibility. I think there's a misspelling. Responsibility to protect individuals' security. This is very different from traditional concept about national sovereignty. All of the government, nation state have the right to protect the national security. It means a collective security, the security of the whole group, the people, the security of the country. But it doesn't mean every individual. But then the new concept, R2P, refers to what? Refer to the government have to respond to individuals' security. This is very different, and is well accepted for quite a long time. Then how about now? And no one no longer talking about R2P. No one require Israel's government to undertake the responsibility for individuals' security. Responsibility for individual security not only means for your own citizens' individuals' security, and also the other foreign countries' individuals' security. That's why the US launched the war against Iraq. So US is responsible for the individual Iraqi people's security. So how about now? What's Netanyahu's responsibility for the individual Palestinians' security? No more. No one talking about it. No one want to no one want to talking about it, right? Situation like that. So now you find that this war mainly have the undermined the norm of human rights. That's the difference between two wars. So if I can summarize this general trend, I think this trend is a kind of a retrogress. The history is making U-turn from globalization to counter-globalization, not only economically, but also politically. And the world, the human being is not making progress, but make step forward, step back, right? So before World War I, and we have 100 years of peace. No one call it a Cold War. Please remember that. And but that time, and there's a century peace, and then we have World War I. The death or casualty of the war over 1 million, right? 10 million. Then we have 20 years of peace, and there's a less casualty of the civilians during the war. And World War II, say the over, I think millions of thousands of millions of the people died, right? And tens of the millions of the people died during the World War II. And then we have the Cold War. Cold War is not that nice, but the war killed less people, less civilians than World War II, at least. The proxy war, but then it kills less people than World War II. After the Cold War, during the post-Cold War period, the end of the trend of the globalization, what happened? You find that the civilians kills very very limited during the war. No matter war in Iraq or the war in Afghanistan or the war in Syria, these wars, you hardly to hear and 10,000 people killed within a month, right? Maybe 1,000 in most cases, and even less than 1,000. At most, that's 2,000 or 3,000 at most a month. Then how about now? The war in Gaza, 3 months, and more than 30,000 people, civilians killed, among them 70% of the women and children. So you see, nowadays, if you use the casualty of the civilian during a war, you find that the world is not making progress, but making retrogress. So certainly people may say that if you use the progress of technology, the world is making forward. That's true. But I'm talking about the politics, talking international politics. In this aspect, no one can argue that now human being is making progress today. And under this this background, under this background of the counter-globalization, we have a major powers competition. Certainly, although there's 2 wars in Gaza and in Ukraine, and China is not participants of any of them, but actually the major powers competition mainly happened between China and the U.S. The reason is not whether China and the U.S. have fell into war or not. The question is that the competition between China and the U.S. has global influence. People say, hey, look at the war in Ukraine and the war in Gaza also have a global influence. Generally speaking, you're talking about this political influence, that's true, mentally. But then the question, the reality is that the war in Ukraine, 3 years have not spilled beyond the border of the Ukraine. Why? And there's a lot of impact on people's mentality and even the economic relations between Russia and the Ukraine. Do the war have a global influence, have a dramatic influence on the global economy? Not that much. I do not see there's a no. But let's look at how about the trade war between China and the US? How much that war, what impact that war had on the global economy, right? The reason is that, look at that. The US account for 26% of the GDP, China account for 70%. When these 2 powers to fight against each other and compete with each other, stop the economic cooperation between each other, you can imagine how much their impact on the global economy, right? Certainly, we have to look at this figure. You'll find that America has more allies, China has less. This asymmetric relationship or asymmetric power structure between the 2 countries. So personally, I will regard it today as a bipolar, but different from that bipolar during Cold War. This is a bipolar between 2 states, not a bipolar between 2 groups. So what's U.S. policy and towards China? I think the U.S. continue the containment policy against China. White House do not use this term. They do not use the term containment. They use the term, they use the term de-risking or decoupling. And actually, from my understanding, U.S. adopted selective containment strategy. That means mainly contain China's technology, not like that what they do to the Russian. And during the Cold War, they contain the Russian comprehensively. But today, only focus on technology. That's different. The term they use is small yard and high funds, right? So ideology during the Cold War used for what? And not only for united allies, but actually US want to expand Americans' ideology and the political system today. And I don't think Biden administration has that kind of concern, let alone the Trump administration. Trump administration had no interest in that. And how about China's strategy? to dealing with the American policy. I think China adopted the very pragmatic policy, first avoiding the new Cold War. If China can avoid the new Cold War, that means we do not want to repeat what the Soviet Union did during the Cold War, and we don't want to repeat the result of the Soviet Union, right? That's the lowest. And is that possible? That's my view. I think very possible, because Cold War required two parties to fight the same thing and adopt the same strategy against each other. And China said that we have no interest in that. We do not want to have a Cold War. We don't want to fight a Cold War against the US. So middle level is that prevent the power gap or capability gap between the US and the US and China being enlarged, and try to resume the trend to continue narrow the power gap between China and US. The highest, and because we has already defined the national rejuvenation as a strategic goal for the government, certainly we hope to shape a favorable geopolitical environment for China. But that's not easy. Just now we show that America has so many allies. It's not easy to shape an international environment like that. How about the other major powers? And Russia has no other choice. And between China and US competition for its own interest, he has to take sides with China. And Japan actually, I think Japan has the chance to take neutrality, a neutral stance, but they prefer to side with the US. And it's very obvious, like Japanese Prime Minister just called the US to strengthen the contentment against China, and during his speech at the US Congress. And Brazil actually, because of his own position, or his location, and he has to, and generally speaking, side with China rather than to side with the US. Yeah, US don't like the Brazil's government. European, it's a little bit complicated. Generally speaking, European take side with the US, but meanwhile, they want to have some kind of independence from the United States. And recently, Chinese leader visited France and talking about how much the European countries will take their independent foreign policies. And the Indian's situation also is the other direction complicated. And it sided with the US in terms of against China. But then come to the relationship with Russia, or the competition between Russia and the US, and the Indian take a neutral stance rather than side with the US. So you see, the major powers strategy toward each other is more complicated than take one side and as granted. That's impossible. Oh, finally, I want to wrap up with that. The international configuration, and from my understanding, the current international may last for at least for next 10 years, a decade. And from 2018 to 2021, and we have a balanced situation between China and the US when most countries adopt the hedging strategy, economically rely on China and side with the US for security. But from 2022, the war in Ukraine took place, and then the hedging strategy was abandoned. No country adopted a hedging strategy. And economic security make the country taking part of the economic relationship from the economic rely on China to add it to the security by the US protection. So now there's a balance. In 2022, the balance tilts toward the US. This year, when the war takes place in Gaza last year and situation changed, and the US isolated himself by its policy toward the war in the Gaza. And not only the state of the global South do not support the US, and even Americans' traditional allies start to keep a distance from the United States, including who? The United Kingdom. Even UK cannot side with the US on the Gaza. Well, actually, that's not the last thing. It's not the most isolation or the strong impression on the Biden administration. What's the most strong impression on him? What's the most difficulty for him to deal with? Domestic situation. The society is widely divided by their policy, and Biden thought foreign policy won't have impact on the domestic vote, right? But now he realized that, no, that's misjudgment about the impact of the war in Gaza. And this is not the situation. I think this impact and will increasing and rather than turned over. And at last, what the coming order will be and the background of counter-globalization and the major powers competition. I think the retrogression and will not go that far to World War I or World War II. No danger of a nuclear war. And during the Chinese leaders visited to Moscow, and China and Russia signed a joint statement that clearly stated jointly, and major powers should not use nuclear weapons and nuclear bullet. And so my understanding is possible to avoid the major war like World War I, World War II. And the war has lasted 3 years. And if in the last 3 years, the war did not escalating into the major war, I don't think the next 3 years it will do. And the current order is dominated by populist, the mentality. The mentality, I will use term xenophobia. That means fear of anything foreign. And try to cut off or reduce connections, contact with the foreign things, foreign technology, foreign capital, foreign culture, even foreign holidays. And try to isolate from each other. So economic security, and although personally I don't like the concept, it's gaining momentum. It's have a larger and larger increasing impact on policy making. That means we're going to witness more decoupling or de-risking policies and income. And so the last is we're in the digital age. In this age, that's my last point. This digital technology will make it impossible for the world to turn back to the Cold War. The reason is that no matter China or US or any other majors, if they want to become the victor of the competition, if they want to win the competition, they have to focus on technology innovation, digital technology innovation, rather than ideological expansion. And proxy war cannot help any country to improve its digital technology innovation. So the major power will very, very cautiously consider how much money they will spend on proxy war, how much money they will spend on the digital technology innovation. So when the most money go to the technology innovation rather than go to the proxy war, I doubt we're going to have a Cold War, because Cold War represent by the proxy war. Okay, finally is that, so if we do the comparison of the three orders and the Cold War, the value competition is between capitalism and communism. And after the Cold War, liberalism dominates the world. But now it's no longer the competition between capitalism and communism, but between liberalism and populism. And mainly not between countries, but within Western democracy. And the norms, and during Cold War, sovereignty norm is gaining momentum. And after Cold War, human rights and norm overwhelmed sovereignty. But now the efficiency of both sovereignty and human rights undermined, becomes less efficient. Thus, the power distribution. During the Cold War, we have the rivalry, so-called it's a symmetric competition between US and the Soviet Union, but then US dominated the world and have the global leadership after Cold War. Now there's a decentralization of power from the US, not a decentralized from US to China. It's a diffuse to many other region powers. Well, finally, I will say, and my opinion is a very optimistic. It's not that optimistic. I'm quite pessimistic. I hope you have a more optimistic about the future of a human being rather than mine. And anyhow, I think we have to do something and to try to make the world better rather than just watch it to retrogress further. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Yan. Fascinating and thought-provoking as always. I should mention that the series that Professor Li mentioned, the Princeton China series, the first book in that series was by Professor Yan, and it was called Ancient Chinese Thought and Modern Chinese Power. And not only that, but the series was meant to showcase academic original works from China, as well as works that have public influence. And shortly after the book was published was a photo of then Vice President Biden holding the book and going on a plane, and it was in the New York Times, right?
I hope that book won't have any impact on his policy toward Gaza.
So do we know if he read the book or?
Well, I think he read the book on the flight.
Oh, okay. Well, so that's quite fascinating. So I want to ask just three questions, and then open it to others. So one question is about the past, and the other is about the present, and then the third is about the future.
Yes.
Because one of your fascinating methodology for this book, Ancient Chinese Thought, Modern Chinese Power, and in many of your other works is you look at the past international relations situation, for example, in warring states China, and you draw many parallels between the situation then and the situation now. And you particularly look at the works of Xunzi, who I agree with you is a great, maybe even perhaps the greatest political theorist in Chinese history and maybe anywhere. So are there any lessons about counter-globalization from past history? Because it's not really a new phenomenon, right? I mean, there were times when the world was economically integrated, and even politically integrated, and then then the order broke down. So when did that happen? And are there any other lessons that we could draw from the past in a way that you did in your book, Ancient Chinese Thought, Modern Chinese Power? That's one question. The other question is about the present. I mean, counter-globalization, does it really apply in the case of China? I mean, China, of course, wants to become self-sufficient in terms of technology because the US obviously wants to undermine China's technological development. But other than that, China is very open to the rest of the world economically and promotes more economic independence, as we see now, President Xi going to Europe, right? So is China part of this trend of counter-globalization? And could you elaborate on that? And finally, the question is about the future, because one of your methodologies is that you don't just随便say things about the future. You have very rigorous methodology that allows you to make predictions. So could you, since you made predictions about the future, could you say a little bit about the methodology that led you to make those predictions? That's one question about the future. And the other question finally is about relations between China and India, because we actually co-edited a book along with two Indian scholars, Amitav Archaya and Rajiv Bhargava, called Bridging Two Worlds, comparing ancient political thought in India and China. And when we started that about 10 years ago, we were quite optimistic about China-India relations. We thought maybe the two powers could recover some of the great interaction from the past, including Buddhism, which came from India and had influence on China. And we were quite optimistic, but things have gone downhill since then. Can you foresee in the future that China-India relations could improve?
Well, I just wonder whether I can borrow a pen and piece of paper so I can remember and answer the question. Too much questions. Okay. Okay, you remind me the question if I forget. And okay. Now, first question is about whether we can learn from the history and for focus the future. I think we do. And in general speaking, for all political scientists, we forecast the future based on our knowledge about history. And the typical case for me to focus the trend of counter-globalization and mainly from the experience of the transition from the spring autumn to the warring state period. And this the transition from the spring autumn and is making retrogress and to the warring states. During spring autumn period, major powers of competition for what? For hegemony and for leadership, for influence. And but they annex some small countries, annex some others territory, but that's not the main purpose for the competition. And during the period of the spring and autumn, and if any country brutally annex other country, will regard it as a very bad country, right? That's why the Qin regarded the best, the worst country, and because they annexed too many countries. But then when we come to the warring state period, the norm changed. The norm is no longer fight for leadership, compete for leadership, or fight for what? For annexing others' territory, right? So I think now we find that in the human being's history is not a move in linearly from the backward or primitive to civilized and become more civilized. In the long run, if you take the 1,000 years or 5,000 years, it may be that true, right? You have 1,500 years ago, and now you find, hey, then it's making progress. But if you cut it every 30 years, the history does not move in that way. They just come, move forward, and then go back, and then move forward, and then go back like that, right? So I think we learned from the history, we can, based on the knowledge of history, we can focus on the future. The second question.
Okay, so let me ask a follow-up to that. So the Warring States period ended when the Qin, as you know, used very brutal means to conquer the countries and establish what was a global order. Is that so? Now, are you saying that now we're in a Warring States period like similar, and that we need a new power to conquer the rest of the world?
No.
No. Okay.
And now we just, I think this period is just like still now, I think it's quite like a spring and autumn. It's not a warring state period. And why is there's some violation of sovereignty, the territorial sovereignty, but that's not the main trend, because this digital age and all of the major powers, except very few policymakers, they misbelieve, and the more land you have, you become stronger and than others. Most policymakers understand the more advanced digital technology you possess, you will be stronger than others. So this digital technology will prevent most of the major powers from annexing others' territory. So I think now it's still more similar like the spring and the autumn period rather than the warring state.
Okay, interesting. So this about the present, is China part of this counter-globalization?
Okay. And actually, I think this is a general trend, and it's a counter-globalization. And by now, I doubt China has the capability and to stop it. And China have to respond to the decoupling, de-risking policy from the U.S. So in some way, and just like the Russians have to take the same policy, tit for tat on the Europe, right? So when the major powers take the tit for tat strategy, it's create a kind of a mutual imitation. So it's make the general trend of the counter-globalization and becomes stronger.
Okay. So, and then the question about the future was two parts. What methodology do you use to make your predictions about the future? And the second is about India-China relations.
Okay. Actually, in every different historical period, and there's always some major factors have impact on the future. And I know many people did the geopolitical analysis, but then my question to this methodology: if geopolitical factors and play that role, I will ask the question: when the geopolitical border didn't change, when the geopolitical power structure didn't change, why the global order changed? The US still the strongest power in the world. Why the US no longer advocating globalization? And globalization actually initiated by the United States. And now Biden administration clearly forbidden using the term globalization in official document. The term is no longer used, no longer spoken by our American officials. They use the term internationalization to replace globalization. Why? They said that we have 3 countries work together. We can use the term internationalization. We'll have 3 parties. We did globalization means that you cooperate with the rest of the world, or at least with the majority of the rest of the world. There's almost 200 members of the UN, and 200 states, and 194 members of UN. So if US cannot cooperate with over 100 countries, they cannot call it a globalization. And especially when they no longer want to cooperate with China, the second largest economy, how can they call it the globalization? That's impossible. So from my understanding, actually nowadays, if you look at what the government do, you will know what the result this policy will bring about. So if you ask what are my methodology is mainly and concerned to use the leadership analysis. I concerned the leaders, different type of leadership have a different preference for strategy. So that's the so-called moral realism. And all major powers won't become rich, just like everyone to become rich. But every individual will use a different approach to become rich, right? Someone working very hard. Someone say, hey, that's too slow. If we will rob the bank and we'll become rich immediately. So the policymaker, their preference for what approach we should use to achieve the same strategic goal, that determines. So today, that's my view. I think a populist leadership becomes the main type of leadership in the world. So that's why when the world, the policymakers are mainly a type of a populist type, and so you cannot expect it, the world and moving in a progressive direction.
Okay, thank you. But why do you, so you use the moral realist methodology, which I think is excellent, but why do you think it won't change, the international order won't change much for 10 years? I mean, why not 20? I think 10 years is actually quite optimistic.
No, that's a very good question. I think now it's a puzzle because among all of us political scientists, we all agree that now populism is very influential, and we have more and more populist leaders in more countries and in this period. But no one can give an explanation why. But then we also observe another historical phenomenon. Before World War I, and we have imperialist leaderships in many countries and even many empires. Before World War II, we have many fascist leaders, not everyone, but many. And after World War II, we have many communist leaders, right? And in 1960s, we have many nationalist leaders. In 1990s, and we have many liberalist leaders. Now we have most of populist leaders. And the people from academia, we still cannot explain why the type of leadership change every 20 to 40 years. And the mechanism is not clear. But then this phenomenon gives us some hope. Anyhow, this type of leadership won't last forever. They will be passed away, right? But then it's not guaranteed you have more positive leadership after them, maybe even worse. No one knows what it is. So when you ask me and what's the reason, I can only give you explanation about this time. why populist leadership become popular? It's because globalization. Globalization and under the leadership, laborist leadership, right, and become stronger. But then globalization make the polarization become the worse, both domestically and internationally. At home, the rich, the gap, the wealth gap between the middle class and the rich dramatically enlarged. At international level, the rich country and the poor country and becomes enlarged, right? So this kind of dramatic increase of wealth polarization makes the middle class unhappy. So then the question, who advocate, who advanced globalization? Laborist elites. So populism do not oppose communism, do not oppose socialism, do not oppose authoritarianism. They oppose what? Populism opposes liberalism. So that's why it's what happened. But then this can only explain why it's happened like this. It cannot explain why before populism didn't come up, but why in this period, and still we need to do some more theoretical studies.
Okay, thank you. Remember last question, China-India relations.
Okay.
We were optimistic, including you 10 years ago. What happened and can it?
Well, yeah, 10 years ago, I don't think people will know, and Modi is a populist leader. At that time, Modi regarded this as a kind of a liberal leader, rather than as a populist leader, right? And because he opened India more than before, and he did a lot of reform at home, so people consider, hey, he is a liberalist out. But now, and people have, hey, wait a minute, he is not. And his domestic policy changed, right? He tried to change the Indians' political system from a secular to religious system. So my understanding, and as long as Modi hold the power in that country, and it's difficult for China and India to dramatically improve their bilateral relations.
Okay, thank you. So I think now we open it up. Professor Lee, maybe you want to be the chair. Okay. So we open it up to questions. Do you want to select them or you want me to?
No, you do it.
Okay. So let's start from here. Well, and maybe who you are and
Okay.
where you're from.
Okay. Hi, Professor Yan, Tsinghua News Agency. My question is about people-to-people diplomacy. So what do you think people-to-people diplomacy or people-to-people exchanges can do to maybe reverse counter-globalism? And specifically, what can NGOs do in this regard, both international NGOs and Chinese NGOs? Thank you.
I think this is a very good question. I like it very much because I really do not agree with Huntington's idea of the conflicts of civilization. And the major parts of competition, that's my view, is not between the people, between the governments, not between the people. And so it's not because people of different nationalities and they have any substantial conflicts between them. Just because they do not know, they suppose, and their their government is right? That kind of belief. So that's why, and for IR, we strongly encourage so-called track 2 diplomacy, encourage people-to-people's contact. And no matter between China and the US or between the US and any other countries, there are a lot of many and cross-nationality marriages. And so this case shows people from different nations should not have that kind of conflicts. There's a political conflicts actually at the top, not at the bottom. So that's why I think now many people regarded the war in Gaza is between the Israeli people and the Palestinians. I don't think it is a problem between the people. It's a problem between the policymakers. And so your question, how important? As long as the people really work together and to maintain our normal social contact, and at least we can slow down the trend of a counter-globalization. Because when there's a people, there's a more social connections, and the people will dislike the deglobalization, because deglobalization policy causes a lot of troubles to individuals, to ordinary peoples. And so that's why I think your question is important, is that we should make more and more people understand that every individual can do something if we work together.
So I hear you.
Well, you know, concerning NGO, I think that's really a very little difficult. And after the Cold War, the number of NGO increased dramatically from hundreds to thousands, 10,000s. The question is that when the NGO increased by 100 times, their influence didn't increase very much. Why? It means, at least the reality tells us, NGO has a very limited impact. And actually, the impact between people is more, it should be more substantial, because every individual really care about their personal interests. NGO have some principles, but when they do it, have difficulties, and they give it up, right? So I do not mean that I look down on the NGO. Certain NGO has play some positive role, but NGO not necessarily have that strong function. Second, and when you use the term NGO, perhaps you only regard to this a positive NGOs. You never concern the impact of negative NGOs. And a lot of international terrorism are also part of the NGOs. So the NGO can have a positive and negative roles like that.
Okay, thank you. We had a question from the left. Let's take it from the right now and say, remember, you press this button, by the way, so that the sound is on, and introduce yourself.
So I'm an MBA student from Hong Kong U, and I was a government officer previously in central government. So Professor Xu, do you think, can you foresee if there is any possibility for multipolar in future, because now it's still dominating by the bipolar power United in China? And secondly, do you think in future India can compete in comprehensive national power? And third, for the innovation gap between US and China, I think especially in AI-driven industries as well as the biomedical industry, and the China still follow up the step of the US. Yeah.
Okay, try to stick to one question. We lost that question, but answer which one you think is most.
Okay, actually, the term of multipolarization is not new. It has been there since the end of the Cold War, 30 years. And then the question is that why the multipolarization have developed for 30 years, we do not have a multipolar world. It's real than multipolarization or bipolarization. So my understanding that the multipolarization is popular is because it's only inconsistent with the political correctness. And for China, we have to adhere to this concept because we don't want to make others feel unhappy. Oh, only two polars, we're not polars, no one likes to hear them. And for the Indian, Russia, Japan, and France, they say, hey, wait a minute. If you're talking bipolar, how about our position? So they said, if you're talking multipolarization, that means we're in the same class. And for US, hey, US, we cannot use the term bipolarization. We cannot give China that kind of respect. We cannot let China stand the same food with equally with us. So US also talking about multipolarization, although we know that's not a real, but then it's a political correct. So multipolarization from Anthony is a political correct, but it do not reflect the objective reality.
Okay, Peter. No.
Thank you very much. I'm Peter Cheng, formerly with this university's politics department, and thank you for your excellent analysis. I just have a question about the future, which you haven't talked about. And that is an alternative future advocated by China, a community with a shared future for mankind. 人類命運共同體. So in Hong Kong, we don't fully understand this concept. I think a lot of people. So can you enlighten us on understanding this as an analytical concept or a policy concept in light of your knowledge of IR and in light of your analysis of the global order? Thank you.
Well, I think China's policy about the shared future actually means that the current situation is not desirable. The current situation is not nice. It's not what we want. We want to change the current order. We want to change the current international environment. Oh, okay, there's a motivation behind it. So what's the content of the shared future? The shared future officially was described as all countries equal, right? And from my understanding, that means it's impossible to make every country have equal capability. But then they do not want the U.S. to dominate the world, because at this moment, China feel very strong pressure from the United States. And if U.S. holds the global leadership, that means we cannot have a bright future for ourselves. For reducing the pressure from the U.S., we certainly want to change the current, reshape the current order. And the last is about what the approach China adopted. I think China tried to, on the one hand, try to manage the conflicts between China and the U.S. for preventing the conflicts between the two countries escalating into war. Even proxy war is not what we want. Second, China considering to improve the relationship with some American traditional allies, especially the Europe. And because Europe have more impact on the world than other American traditional allies, like the Japan, South Korea, and other countries. And so because European countries have more impact than their other countries. And third is nothing secret. Chinese government frequently repeated, and China heavily rely on the global South states. And concerning that, as long as we get the support from the majority of the global South states, and then we can have a basic political base in the world.
Okay, Jerry had a question.
Thank you.
Again, introduce yourself. Yeah.
Thank you very much. The depth of your analysis. I have a simple question, I think. Based on your talk today, the implications, how do you see the implications for the flow, the global flow of talent, particularly in areas that deal with technological innovation? It seems to me that the battle is going to be, there could be a bifurcation or a binary situation with regard to technology development globally. So, and the interdependence is clearly there. And I just wanted to know how you see that playing a role within the various types of anti-globalization or the deglobalization in the next, say, 10 years. There you go. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Well, I think there. First, I want to talking about the phenomenon. You find that now the talent flow is not from like what we witnessed in 1980s and 1990s. And the U.S. also lost a lot of talent. China lost of talent. And you find that most of the talent flow mainly to the middle countries, not to the great powers. And I think the Singapore and is their favorite place. And then followed by Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and the North European countries and like that. And why not these talent flow to the middle powers rather than to the great powers. My understanding, they do not have good expectation for the great powers. So human beings do something and actually depends on what? Depends on their future. It's not how rich you are, depends on how much wealth you are going to create in the future. It's not what your position is and what your future position is. And this is a driving force behind the intelligent flow. So whether the intelligent flow can in some way help to slow down the counter-globalization, I don't think so. Because these people do not hold the power. And the counter-globalization only driven by governments. If this flow talents, they have very limited chance to get into the government, to hold a country's power. As long as they have no power, they cannot stop this trend of the counter-globalization, just like the movement of anti-globalization in early 1990s. So I think this, I'm very pessimistic about it.
Okay. I'm trying to read his handwriting. Any question from the right side here? Yes.
Thank you, Professor Bell and Professor Yan. I think you mentioned in your lecture, oh, sorry, I'm a journalist with the South China Morning Post. I think you mentioned in your lecture that you think the US and China are still very likely to avoid a Cold War. Do you think the current governments, I mean, since the two leaders met in San Francisco last year, the recent efforts the two governments have put in, do you think they are on the right track to manage their tensions so that they could avoid a Cold War? And also whether the outcome of the US election in November and the possibility of a return of Donald Trump could completely change the landscape and relations right now?
Well, I think actually, I think the situation changed, not completely, but changed in some degree. And from the China-US summit in at San Francisco in last October, and both sides, from my understanding, reached a kind of understanding, and we will continue the competition, and possibly we use the term rivalry, but we should prevent war, and from don't use the war competing. So I think this is a basic understanding, and that do not reduce the competition or the conflicts between China and the US in other fields, especially not in the domain of the technology. And nowadays, it seems to me not only technology is possibly and spill over, and from the domain of technology to and the commercial area, like they're talking about the EV and battery and the solar plates. And so I think most people expected if Trump win the coming election, and I think China and the US will have more conflicts over the economic issues.
We had a question from David Pearson. Yeah, David Pearson. Yeah, if you could.
Yeah, I'm a correspondent with the New York Times. My question is in regards to China's quote unquote no limits relationship with Russia. Do you think this is an enduring relationship? Do you think China is stronger in the long run, getting closer with Russia, given that the war in Ukraine has undermined China's calls for sovereignty? It's created tensions with its #2 regional trading partner in the EU. It's globalized the Taiwanese issue on some level as well. What do you think of the future of this relationship?
Well, I just returned from the Europe, and through my visit, I find that, and the policymakers and have a different opinion from the public opinion on the war in Ukraine. And more and more Europeans realize that the war cannot be ended in short term. When I say short term, it doesn't means it this year. It could be last for few years, maybe even longer. And but the policymakers, they pretend don't know. They But then you notice that, and European policymakers no longer use the term and help the Ukraine to win the war. They no longer use the term. They start to use the term, they cannot allow the European to lose the war. Okay, actually from my understanding, and Russia do not have this capability to win the war at this moment, and possibly not next year, and maybe next few years. As long as the US and continue the huge scale of arms aid to Ukraine. So the war could be last continuously, undermine the capability, both Russia and the European states. And the US possibly benefit from the war. Maybe I shouldn't argue in that way. And if you look at the real situation, the US has benefited a lot from the war. And they sell more oils and make the Europeans rely on the US and the distance from China. And the American reshaped the relationship with the traditional allies. And the economics, the concept of economic security tilt the balance between China and the US toward the US. So by now, I cannot see any realistic reason for White House to stop the war in Ukraine. They will continue the war. So from my understanding, the war, as long as the war continue to undermine Russia and Europe, and US arms aid to Ukraine won't stop. So how about China and the Russia's relations? I think the last 3 years has illustrated the bilateral relationship between China and Russia. I think this kind of a relationship will continue.
Okay. Yes, Jennifer. No, okay.
How about, that's better. Thank you. I'm Jennifer Jett from NBC News. Just going back to one of Professor Bell's earlier questions, do you see China doing anything to contribute to the counter-globalization trend, whether it's proactively or in response to what other countries are doing?
Well, just now, I think I have suggest that. And regarding the globalization, China support the economic part, economic globalization, but never said that support the political globalization, right? So in terms of this part, I mean the economic globalization, China's policy is very positive. China continuously to suggest we should forward the global economic globalization. The reason is very simple. Just like Trump once said, China benefit from the globalization more than United States. What's the reason for China abandon globalization? If we benefit more from economic globalization than anyone else, why we should stop it? So my understanding, China's policy is very positive to support economic globalization. That's why, and take the policy oppose Americans' small yard and high fence policy against the concept of de-risking and decoupling, because these policies stopped the globalization. But if you're talking about the political part, that will be different. And China official stance is very clear about the political part of the globalization. China encourage, have a intolerant or inclusive policy for diversity of political systems. That means do not require and all countries and develop a similar political system, and should allow all countries and have their own and political system and ideology.
Okay, we had a question.
I'm Charlie Chow from Mingpao Daily News. I remember about around 12 years ago, Professor Yan has suggested the world is going into the status of by multipolarity, 两强多强. And I would like to ask whether 12 years later, this model still applies to what you just mentioned about the counter-globalization trend, and in such counter-globalization trend, if it's a really the by multipolar world, how China view on its competition with the United States on getting more support from those middle powers, and especially after the war in Ukraine and in Gaza.
Well, I think this question is very academic and discussing about relationship between the bipolar structure, power structure, and the trend of a globalization of a global order. Actually, when we're talking, if we recall the pie, and you find that China and US are put together, account for more than 40% of the global GDP, right? 26 plus 17. And what does it mean? It means that any of them exclude from the globalization. There's no globalization. You cannot exclude 26% from the world, and you call it globalization. You cannot exclude the 17% of the world and as a globalization. So that means neither side and can continue the globalization without cooperating with the other side. This let alone the other part, the cooperating with the other parts. So this that's why the China-US bipolar configuration is a determining factor for whether we are going to have a globalization or counter-globalization. My understanding, only when China and the US work together, turn their relationship like those between France and the Germany to provide a joint leadership for the EU, and then the globalization can moving forward. And as long as these two countries cannot cooperate with each other and more decoupling, de-risking between them, and I doubt the globalization can resume. Even all of the other powers work together, and with any of the sides, they cannot resume the globalization because any of these two powers exclude from this trend. There's no globalization.
I'd like to end with one last question, because I know you call yourself a pessimist, but I'd say you're a pessimist with optimistic characteristics. So I want you to say, what makes you most optimistic, one thing about China, and what makes you most optimistic about the US?
Okay. And most opposite side from China is that optimistic thing is that Chinese government, no matter what leadership will change, and principle of opening up and the reform cannot be abandoned. And this principle adopted by Deng Xiaoping in 1978 is have lasted for 40 years. I'm 100% sure it will continue at least for another 10 years, right? American side, I think American side, the Cold War generation, the leadership of Cold War generation will pass away very soon. I don't think the people of the 70s and the 80s will hold the power for another 20 years. They're too old. And the young people will have the chance to hold power. And the people grown up after the Cold War have a different mentality from the Cold War generation like me, right? We grown up in the Cold War, our mentality and have a strong impact in some way shaped by the history. But for those young generation in the US, and they will have different mentality. So look at it today, the students on the campus, they hold a very different view from the government.
Okay, thank you so much.